I woke up to a silence that felt heavy, a silence that didn't end oppose. T just mean the house was empty. It meant everything that was left of my wife had been erased, and when I walked out onto my porch at 4 a.m. with a lukewarm cup of coffee, I didn't end oppose. T see the detached garage where Sarah had spent 30 years painting her soul on a canvas. Instead, I saw a pile of splintered cedar and crushed easels under the glare of a single street lamp. There was no warning, no phone call, just a yellow citation taped to a stake in the mud and a $2,000 bill from the Stonegate Homeowners Association. And when the president, a woman named Victoria Vance who smelled like expensive gin and entitlement, showed up an hour later to sneer at the wreckage, she told me that maybe now the neighborhood would finally look decent. But what she didn't realize was that the demolition company she'd hired to destroy my life was a company I'd bought 2 years ago, which meant every truck that crushed Sarah's final, unfinished paintings was a truck I owned, and Victoria had just handed me the perfect documented paper trail to end her reign forever. You see, I'm Elias Thorne, and at 55, I've spent most of my life moving heavy things, first in commercial construction and then by building Thorne Heavy Recovery from a single rusted flatbed into a fleet of 16 trucks. And I've always been the kind of guy who stays under the radar, driving an old Ford F-150 and wearing work boots that have seen better days. So when Sarah passed away from a sudden stroke 6 months ago, I retreated into the one place that still smelled like her, which was that old garage. It was a beautiful, non-conforming structure built back in the late 80s, long before the HOA turned this place into a Stepford wife nightmare. And inside, it was chaos in the best way possible, with tubes of cobalt blue and burnt sienna scattered everywhere and the light hitting her Vermont landscapes just right through the skylights. And I'd spend my evenings there, just sitting in her old wicker chair, trying to figure out how to be a person again without the woman who'd been my compass for 3 decades. But Victoria Vance didn't care about grief, because to Victoria, the world was a spreadsheet and anything that didn't end oppose. T fit her in quote, coastal chic in quote. Aesthetic was a bug to be squashed, and since she'd moved into the 6-bedroom mansion down the street, she'd made it her personal mission to, in quote, clean up in quote, our corner of the world. She'd spend her Saturdays patrolling the sidewalks in a white Tesla, taking photos of grass that was half an inch too long or trash cans left out 2 hours past pickup. But she had a special kind of venom for me. Maybe because I didn't end oppose, T-bow to her, or maybe because my garage was the only thing in the neighborhood that had actual character. And she'd tell me at every board meeting that property values were a collective responsibility, and that my end quote, dilapidated shack and quote, was a cancer on our street and oppose as potential. I'd show her the original permits. I'd explain the history. But talking to Victoria was like trying to argue with a hurricane. She didn't end oppose. To want to hear the truth, she just wanted to win. And she'd recruited 2 other board members, a retired actuary named Milton and a social climber named Brenda, to be her personal firing squad, making life miserable for anyone who didn't end oppose. T spent $10,000 on landscaping every spring. The harassment started small, with letters about the end quote, structural integrity in quote, of my roof, then moved to fines for in quote, unauthorized artistic activity in quote, because Sarah used to teach kids to paint in there, and I fought them all, filing appeals and attending meetings where Victoria would just look at her manicured nails while I spoke. But I never expected them to go nuclear while I was 500 miles away. I'd driven down to Richmond to visit my daughter and her new baby, thinking a weekend away from the ghosts of the house would do me good, and I'd checked the security app on my phone once or twice, but didn't in oppose. TC anything out of the ordinary, or so I thought, because Victoria had been smart. She'd called the demolition in at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, claiming it was an end quote, emergency structural collapse, hazard end quote, to bypass the usual 48-hour notice period required by the bylaws. When I stood there in the mud that morning, looking at the spot where Sarah's easel used to be, I felt a kind of cold, vibrating fury that I haven in oppose. T felt since I was 20 years old, and I didn't oppose. T yell, I didn't oppose. T throw things, I just walked back inside, sat at my desk, and opened the business portal for Titan Demolition and Hauling, a small firm I'd acquired and tucked under my corporate umbrella a few years back to handle the heavy debris side of my recovery business. I saw the work order immediately, end quote. Emergency hazard removal, 114 Oak Street, end quote. Authorized by Victoria Vance on behalf of Stonegate HOA. And it even had a recording of the dispatch call, because I'm a stickler for liability, and hearing her voice, that high-pitched, fake concerned warble, telling my dispatcher that the building was, end quote, leaning toward the sidewalk and threatening the safety of the neighborhood children, end quote, made the hair on my arm stand up. She'd lied through her teeth to my own employees to get them to destroy my property, and she'd even used the HOA's emergency fund to pay the invoice, which was already processed and sitting in my company's accounts receivable. The next few weeks were a study in what I like to call, end quote, controlled demolition, end quote, because Sarah always said I had the patience of a mountain, and if Victoria wanted to play games with power, I was going to show her what actual power looked like. So I started by rebuilding, but not just a garage. I hired my best crew, and we put up a state-of-the-art studio on the exact same footprint, using the highest grade materials allowed by the county, and I made sure every single bolt and shingle was triple-checked by the city inspectors before Victoria even knew what was happening. When she saw the new structure, she practically blew a fuse, showing up on my lawn with her little clipboard and telling me I was in, end quote, direct defiance, end quote, of the board's decision, but I just smiled at her, handed her a copy of the new permits, and told her that since the previous, end quote, hazard, end quote, had been removed, I was simply exercising my right to restore my property. And that's when she decided to pivot to what she thought was her ace in the hole, parking warfare. She started using her Tesla to block my driveway every single morning. Just as the sun was coming up, she'd park it at a 45-degree angle so I couldn't oppose to get my truck out to go to the shop. And when I'd ask her to move, she'd look at her watch and say she was, end quote, just waiting for a delivery, end quote, or, end quote, surveying the common area, end quote, and that I should learn to be more patient. It was petty, it was childish, and it was exactly what I needed because Victoria didn't oppose. T know that Titan was an oppose. T my only company, she didn't oppose. T know I owned Thorn Heavy Recovery, the very company the city contracted for residential enforcement, and she definitely didn't oppose. T know I'd already installed 4K infrared cameras that were capturing every single second of her illegal parking, her smug little smiles, and the way she'd sit in her car and laugh while I stood on my porch with my coffee. I started digging into the HOA's books too, because someone like Victoria always leaves a trail, and I found out she'd been using the, end quote, emergency fund, end quote, like a personal piggy bank. She'd, end quote, authorized, end quote, 6 different projects in the last year that all conveniently went to a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law. And she'd been citing people for fence height violations while her own back fence was 6 inches over the limit. I was gathering the rope, and Victoria was more than happy to stick her head in the noose, especially when she decided to call a, end quote, community safety meeting, end quote, to discuss my, end quote, aggressive surveillance, end quote, and, end quote, non-compliant construction, end quote, inviting the whole neighborhood to the community center on a Saturday afternoon, thinking she was going to have a public trial where she'd be the judge, jury, and executioner. The day of the meeting was one of those crisp, bright autumn days, and the community center was packed with neighbors who were tired of being bullied but too afraid to speak up, and Victoria was up there at the podium, looking like she was presiding over a royal court, showing slides of my new garage and calling it a, end quote, monument to one man in oppose, his ego, end quote. She talked about how it was a, end quote, disruptive element, end quote, and how the neighborhood needed, end quote, unified leadership, end quote, to protect their investments. But when she opened the floor for questions, I didn't oppose. T asked a question. I just walked up to the front with a laptop and a thumb drive, and I asked the tech guy to plug it in, and the look on Victoria's face when the first image popped up on the big screen, a high-res photo of her Tesla BLO, king my driveway for the 14th day in a row, was worth every penny I'd ever made. I started scrolling through the evidence, the dispatch recordings where she lied about the, end quote, collapsing, end quote, garage, the invoices showing she'd paid my own company $1,200 of the neighbors in oppose, money to destroy a legal structure, and the bank records I'd legally obtained through a records request that showed the kickbacks to her brother-in-law and oppose as company. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that usually happens right before a thunderstorm. And then I played the audio of her telling me on my porch that she had, end quote, connections in this county, end quote, And that in quote, people like me in quote, didn't oppose, T belong in Stonegate. I looked at the crowd, at Milton and Brenda, who were suddenly trying to shrink into their chairs, and I told them that as the owner of Thorn Heavy Recovery, I've been the one keeping the city's contract for 15 years, and that I'd been letting Victoria's behavior slide to see how far she'd go. But that as of 5 minutes ago, her Tesla, which was currently parked in a fire lane outside the community center, was being hooked up to one of my trucks. The chaos that followed was beautiful. Victoria tried to scream that I was hacking her life, that I was a stalker, but the neighbors had seen enough, and they started standing up one by one, telling their own stories of how she'd fined them for having the wrong color mulch, or how she'd threatened to lean their houses over a dead rose bush. By the time we walked out to the parking lot, my lead driver, a big guy named Marcus who knew exactly what the situation was, had Victoria's Tesla 6 feet in the air, and she was hysterical, crying about, in quote, illegal seizure, in quote, while Deputy Miller, a guy I've known for 20 years, just stood there with his arms crossed, reviewing the footage on my phone of her parking in that fire lane. The fallout was a total wipeout for her. The board was dissolved within 48 hours. Victoria was served with a massive lawsuit for fraud and property destruction, and the county started an investigation into the HOA's finances that eventually led to her being indicted for embezzlement. I didn't in oppose. To get my garage back, I got a neighborhood that actually felt like a community again, but I still wonder sometimes about the line between justice and revenge, and whether I should have just let it go for the sake of peace. My daughter says I did what Mom would have wanted, that Sarah would have loved the irony of the whole thing. But I want to know what you think. Did I go too far by using my own companies to bait her into a trap? Or is this just the price people like Victoria pay when they decide to mess with a man who has nothing left to lose but his memories? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I'm the hero of this story or just a different kind of bully. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the little guy finally gets to push back.